In 1940, a group of Russian scientists selected 5 prisoners of war to serve as test subjects for a sleep deprivation study. The experiment would involve keeping the subjects awake for 15 days using a gas-based stimulant. To ensure the gas wouldn't kill the subjects, they were confined to a sealed chamber in order to monitor their oxygen intake. They would be given a few books and enough dried food to sustain them for over a month. However, they were not supplied running water, toilets, or bedding for their cots. Two-way microphones had been installed for communication, and scientists would observe the subjects through 5-inch thick glass windows the size of portholes. The experiment had gone smoothly for the first 5 days, with the test subjects showing minimal complaints. The men had been falsely assured they would be granted freedom if they endured the test without sleeping for 30 days. The scientists meticulously monitored every action of the men, noting that on day 4, their conversations turned dark as they began discussing traumatic past experiences. On day 6, the subjects started to voice their grievances about what led them to the chamber, and signs of severe paranoia began to emerge. They stopped talking to each other and took turns whispering into the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Strangely, all 5 captives seemed convinced they could gain the trust of the experimenters by turning against one another. Researchers attributed the behavior to the effects of the gas. After 9 days, one of the subjects suddenly began screaming. He sprinted the length of the chamber and repeatedly yelled for 3 hours. Despite ongoing attempts to scream, he could only produce occasional raspy squeals. Researchers concluded that the man had physically torn his vocal cords. Oddly, the other subjects did not react. They just continued whispering into the microphones until another man began to scream. The subjects who weren't screaming started ripping books apart, covering page after page with their feces, and then calmly pasting the defiled pages over the glass portholes. The screams and deranged whispers came to an abrupt halt. Over the following 3 days, no sound was heard from within the chamber. Researchers checked the microphones hourly, thinking it was impossible for anybody to be alive and remain silent. But heightened oxygen levels in the chamber indicated that all 5 men must be alive. On the morning of the 14th day, researchers broke protocol and used the intercom speakers, hoping to provoke a response. A firm announcement echoed through the chamber, directing the subjects to clear the door and lie flat on the floor. They were told if they followed orders, one of them would be released. A singular response came through the microphone saying, "We no longer want to be freed." Researchers and the military forces funding the experiment debated the next step. Unable to provoke any more responses using the intercom, it was decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The room was flushed with fresh air as 3 different voices emanated from the microphones, begging for the gas to be turned back on. Screams echoed from the chamber, both from the captives and the soldiers who first laid sights on the horrors within the room. 4 of the 5 test subjects were alive, although it didn't appear that way. The food rations had remained untouched after day 5, with chunks of flesh from the deceased subject obstructing the drain, causing 4 inches of murky water to build up on the floor. While most of the remaining 4 subjects' upper bodies were still intact, the abdominal organs below the rib cage had been removed. The blood vessels and organs had been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all four could be seen working, digesting food. It became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh, which they had been eating over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives, but still, many refused to return to the chamber. The subjects continued to scream to be left where they were, while begging and demanding that the gas be turned back on, or else they would fall asleep. The four subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. In the struggle, one of the four living subjects had his spleen ruptured and bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. The subject had been injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of one doctor. The subject's heart continued to beat for a full 2 minutes after he bled out, to the point where there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after his heart stopped, the man continued to scream and flail, repeating the word more over and over, weaker and weaker, until falling silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begged for gas and demanded to be kept awake. In the process of preparing one of the subjects to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative they had given him for the surgery. The subject fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear through a thick leather strap, even though a 200-pound soldier was holding him down. As soon as the man was administered the anesthetic, his eyes closed and his heart stopped. The autopsy showed that the subject had triple the amount of oxygen in his blood than normal. The muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in the struggle not to be subdued. The mute subject, who had destroyed his vocal cords, was unable to beg or object to surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested they try the surgery without anesthetic. The mute subject did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The presiding surgeon repeatedly stated that it should be medically impossible for the patient to still be alive. A nurse assisting in the surgery said she saw the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. After the operation, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, struggling while attempting to talk. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. The mute subject wrote, "Keep cutting." The other test subject, the one who could speak, was given the same surgery, as well without anesthetics. However, he had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to operate while the patient laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subject could only follow the attending researchers with his eyes. After the paralytic lost its effect, the man forcefully tried to escape his bonds. As soon as the subject regained his voice, he began pleading for more stimulant gas. Researchers attempted to ask the subject why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their guts, and why they wanted to be administered the gas again. The subject simply replied, "I must remain awake." The 2 remaining subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber. Faced with disapproval for not achieving the project's goals, the researchers contemplated euthanizing the surviving subjects. However, the commanding Soviet officer wanted to continue the experiment and give them more stimulant gas. The researchers were overruled. To everyone's surprise, the 2 subjects stopped struggling the moment it was revealed they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that both men were putting up a great effort to stay awake. The subject who could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds, holding his head off his pillow, and blinking rapidly. Brainwaves for the 2 subjects were normal most of the time, but they started flatlining inexplicably in the hours preceding being placed in the chamber. It looked as if they were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. As most of the research team was leaving the chamber, the subject who could speak began thrashing around and screaming to seal the room. At the exact moment, the mute subject started convulsing. Both brainwave readings were showing the same flat lines. With no hesitation, the commander, who had seen potential in the experiment, immediately sealed the room and turned on the gas, leaving a lone researcher trapped with the 2 remaining subjects. The panicked researcher ran to one of the porthole windows and pleaded to be released, before quickly drawing his pistol, turning, and shooting the closest subject to him. He then placed his back against the wall of the chamber and pointed his weapon towards the remaining subject's bed. The commander and research team gathered around the portholes as the terrified researcher began to scream. "I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you." "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know. I have to know." The final subject sat smiling in his bed as stimulant gas filled the room. A series of high-pitched, raspy squeals echoed off the chamber walls. The researcher stood frozen in place. He realized there were no answers to be given. He had shot the subject who could speak. He took aim at the mute subject's heart and pulled the trigger.